What a day, what a night, and it's best when we're in community. So we appreciate you coming out to Women in Architecture's program tonight. And I'm Rosalind Sang. I am the co-chair for Women in Architecture Committee, here with my co-chair Wells. We have several steering committees planted throughout, Vivian Lee and Sarah Nagan, if you want to just wave your hands. And if I missed any steering committee member, wave your hand. So I thought it would be appropriate, I don't know if you listened to Kamala's concession speech, which was very gracious and I think very fitting to kind of ease us into tonight. The focus really was about gratitude, love, and resolve. And I'm just going to reiterate some of the key phrases that kind of popped out, and hopefully this can help us ease into the panel tonight. The light of America's promise will always burn bright, as long as we never give up and never stop fighting. Do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. It's a time to roll up our sleeves. It's a time to mobilize. And then she repeated an adage, a law of history. Only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. Let's fill the sky with the light of a billion stars, the light of optimism, faith, truth, and service. So it is the mission of Women in Architecture to elevate and promote women in the industry and the allied industries alongside with our male allies. So we thank you all for attending tonight. Just a few orders of business here about some of our upcoming Women in Architecture events. On Thursday, November 21st, in lieu of our committee meeting, take note of no committee meeting, we are celebrating the Women Fellows. There were 5 from the AIA New York chapter that were elevated this year, and we are celebrating in Cosentino's showroom, so please come to that. On Monday, December 9th, is our annual speed mentoring that always gets sold out. We have 25 to 30 women owners, business owners, and principals and leaders of firms. And we have groups of 4 architects and practitioners of different levels that essentially speed rotate in groups of like 20 minutes. And then I brought some great news this past week that our annual recognition party and holiday party that takes place in January, Brickworks Design Studios has agreed to host us, which is very nice of them. They've got a beautiful showroom on 5th Avenue if you've not been there. And look out, because if you or one of your colleagues has gotten licensed, this is to celebrate and honor recently licensed women in the prior year. So if you have a woman colleague who was recently licensed this year, or you yourself, we're going to be putting that online in early December for you to apply for that award, and then at the recognition party, that's when we would award you amongst all the others. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the event for tonight. And Mindy No here is a principal at Perkins Eastman, and she brought the event to Women in Architecture. She said, you know what, there's a lot of women on this team. There's a lot of women and men, but you know, in light of our mission, we wanted to really celebrate kind of the complexity of this TSX Broadway project. So we've put together an amazing panel, and which includes Deborah Barros, Senior Associate at WJE Engineers and Architects, Dominic Delizo, Vice President, L&L Holdings, Mindy, who I've introduced, Alison Pimpinella, Superintendent Structure Tone, and Judith Saltzman, Founding Principal of Saltzman Architects. So without further ado, Mindy, I'll hand it off to you, and let's get started.
Thank you, Rosalind. So just before we get to the project overview, a few learning objectives. You're getting 1.5 minutes today, but as we look at TSX Broadway, which in itself is, I would say, an immersive entertainment and hospitality experience, but also the collaboration and the teamwork that it took to get this project done. We're also going to discuss and strategize about historic buildings, especially the protection, stabilization, as well as the monitoring that is involved. And then, how communication can be effective in pursuing design goals. So this immersive team here, and many of the team members here are, you know, they're not even listed here. There's a complex team members, but you can start to see here as basically Rosalind introduced us, so we don't have to reintroduce ourselves. A bit about the team. You can see the various stakeholders, including developers, owners, the theater, Palace Theater, and Palace Theater had its own consultants also. With the sub-consultants, the engineers, as well as peer reviewers. This in itself, we tried to create an org chart. However, it was very difficult to make it linear because a lot of communication was going circular, as well as being able to work with the various stakeholders. Again, just understanding that beyond the technical aspect of the expertise of the team, that communication was key to how we were able to look at understanding expectations of multiple stakeholders and decision makers, how we coordinated amongst the owners, the developers, the consultants, the peer reviewers, the designers, technical engineering. In that aspect, that the success of this project really was the relationships and how we communicated with each other. Just as a broad overview on TSX, 47th and 7th Avenue. That's where the TKTS booth is, where Perkins also designed that. However, it's a major redevelopment of a transformational public realm. There's an indoor-outdoor public stage element that engages Times Square. That if you've seen performances by Snoop Dogg or Jungkook from BTS, when that stage opens and it's projected onto the Times Square, it's quite immersive and engaging. And I feel that, you know, this has become a cultural and hospitality destination thing. As well as there's a historic theater component with TSX and its elevational lift of the theater to create more retail space below. So there's this whole story here that you can't even capture in 1.5 hours, that it's only one part of the story. $2.5 billion redevelopment. Includes 47 floors with a hotel up above. Again, lifting of the palace and restoration and rehabilitation of the Palace Theater that created new retail space. As well as, I would say, over 40,000 display screen, 40,000 square feet of display screen that actually engages the public realm, but also being able to provide signage, as well as this entire building can be lit up with signage with terraces, hotels. It has become a hospitality destination with a hotel component and the theater also. Some of the challenges, there were many, including team coordination and the integration of the various teams. However, we had regulatory improvements that included landmarks, retaining the zoning floor area, looking at partial demolition. So if we go through a sequence of operation of the partial demolition to the stabilization of the theater, to the lift of the theater, and being able to describe the regulatory review processes as well as historic preservation and restoration. Just as a broad overview of the development, you can see here the podium with the retail space and the theater, as well as the outdoor stage, indoor-outdoor stage, as well as the terraces that also have hotel floor lobbies, and then being able to communicate that with the hotel, restaurants, as well as this entertainment LED screens incorporated into the facade. So before we get to the specifics of the theater, I wanted to sort of give people a broad overview of the code. This is behind the signage, and I am sure that if you have walked through Times Square, that signage is very immersive. However, behind the signage, there's obviously components of retail balconies, and then a podium in the hotel lobby, as well as the terraces. The facade was incorporated to try to capture the views of Times Square, especially with the hotel windows. And then you can start to see here on the lower left diagram the views from the hotel rooms. Just as a brief overview of the cladding, it was designed to meet zone green to get more FAR, but also to colors of mullions for curtain wall systems, as well as metal panels, and being able to look at organization of the curtain wall with the LED signage that's sort of aligned, and you could start to see a little bit more development on how the signage works as an overall. There are LED nodes at every stack joint, so they are totally programmable as well as the full range of colors. Just do a before and after, so the left, yes, the left is before. And you can start to see here the old DoubleTree Hotel with the static sign, and then now you have an immersive dynamic signage. There's also static signage, but being able to program the LED nodes up through the building. And then just a few, completed shots. You can start to see here the immersive nature right here. This is, I don't know if you walked through Times Square recently, but this seamless, sort of discrete stage doors is one of the largest stage doors ever of LED screens, and they open up to present this stage that, it's quite immersive. So.
Thank you, Mindy, for the introduction to TSX Broadway, and now I'm going to invite you, the audience, to step back in time with me to take a look at the development of the site and also to consider the historic interior landmark, the jewel at the heart of TSX Broadway, which is the Palace Theater. It's important for me to let you know that the perspective I'm going to provide here comes from my experience of almost 10 years on the project, 9 years to be more specific, and that straddles two different companies and two different kinds of experience. I was the project architect and project manager with PDW Architects at the inception of this project in 2012. I've been involved since 2015 when we were designing the entire development, the concept design, and also obtaining key regulatory approvals for this project. And also working a lot of retail options for the client to go after the potential partners on this project. And then I will also share my experience interfacing with Wisden Elsner, Engineers and Architects, the company that I'm with now. We are engineers, architects, and material scientists working from the macro scale, and we're talking about movable bridges, to micro scale, materials analysis, preservation, building closures, anything in between in terms of design and consultancy. So with that in mind, I would then start focusing your attention on that building there all the way to your right, which is the Palace Theater. That arch was over the original entrance that faces 7th Avenue, and above you have the hotel tower. The Palace Theater has been contributing to this bustling environment of Times Square since 1912-13 when it first opened. The entrance now has been changed to 47th Street in the new development, which is something worth considering. The theater box, as we came to call it, which is the auditorium and the stage house, they're actually recessed in the back behind the signage. And you can see that signage was always a very important component of this Times Square environment, which served as an inspiration as well for the design at TSX. So, I would say that let's agree, and I hope by the end of this presentation you agree with me, that this site has lived a most eventful life. Here you can see on this picture here to your left, which is an article from the Engineering News Record in November 1989, celebrating the construction of a 43-story tall hotel atop the theater box, as we call it. So you can see here in this photograph that in order to straddle the volume of the theater house, we had trusses, bridge-like structures really, supported by massive super columns, two on the west side and two on the east side back of the stage house. So here's this development celebrated. The theater is not impacted necessarily, much impacted by this development. Let's remember this is an interior landmark. So then here comes 2012. A former client of BBDW, former architect, developer, he had this motto: we need to design the opportunity to design. And so he did. He passed by that building there. This photo is from around 2017. And he looked at the theater on the ground. If he lifted the theater, he could create additional 2 levels of retail. If he were to demolish up to 75% of the zoning area of the tower, he could then rebuild it to meet more modern standards. And he could then also improve the urban environment by addressing that hodgepodge of signage that we see there. And also that corner has an MTA entrance to complicate matters. Let's all remember that. So this was what the opportunity to design gave us, a lot to design. So we worked on it until 2017. At that time, the BDW decided to focus on the theater itself as preservation architects and architects of record for that. And then we have Mancini Duffy got engaged and developed and took it through all the ends. And we also have Bernie Zisman who developed the facade. And we stayed with the theater. So it was very clear that we had at the core of that development to the right now this Fabergé egg of a theater that needed to be carefully conserved, preserved, protected, and monitored so that the lift, which was at the inception of this project, could occur and be successful. So it could be lifted and snugly fit in the concrete and steel bowels of TSX Broadway. So this video here tells you why we had reasons for concern, of course. There was a lot of construction activity, vibration-inducing activity, and WJU was also very involved in the vibration monitoring, looking at crack gauges and data loggers and tilt meters. So all this was implemented really early on. So let me start this video for you, and you can see when you say vibration-inducing what we're talking about here. And I thought it was my video sound. So at any given moment, you would have, here it is, the Fabergé egg at the heart of the theater. Meanwhile, we need to prepare the cellar, excavate, because we needed to provide a ring beam all around the theater and provide new lifting posts in order for the theater to be lifted. Meanwhile, the tower needs to be demolished. Well, I said 75% of its zoning floor area, 25% retained, which allowed the rebuild to have the same square footage of the previous zoning resolution. Meanwhile, we have ring beams in place, the jacks are all in place, the temporary structure is all in place, but we needed to clear the top of the theater, but before we need to build a new structure that could support the floors above, and here comes the Fabergé egg, it's snugly fit in its new position. And then after that, the full construction, reconstruction of the floors, led by Mancini and Perkins, took place, and the development was completed. So that sets the stage for us to then remind ourselves that if it wasn't for the lift of the theater, TSX Broadway would not exist. So one of the main early regulatory approvals we got was in 2015. We obtained approval from Landmarks Preservation Commission to do this. They accepted it with a number of considerations. So from that point on, we had a very close relationship with them in order to provide mock-ups, materials, a very long negotiation, which was really extensive. And meanwhile, that also gives an opportunity to engage with a panel of advisors for the Nederlander organization. And one of them is Judy Salzman, who's here, who's been engaged since 2015, Judy? 2015. So I invite Judith to come here and join me to explain from her seat as the owner, or advising the owner, how she saw the development from perspective.
Yes, so I was brought in 2015 by the Nederlander organization, who owned and operated the theater from 1965. And I've worked on a lot of preservation projects and a lot of theater projects, but when this was presented to me, the concept behind it, I was like, oh my God, how are they going to do this? And I have to say, it was one of the most difficult, complex, frustrating and exciting projects in the course of my career. And as Deborah said, there was this Fabergé egg, and everybody knows who worked with me on this project that I was very, very concerned because I had worked on many plaster projects that had ornamental fibrous plaster, a material that was used in the late 19th and early 20th century that is subject to degradation from the environment, from water, from use, and I had seen plaster collapse in theaters that weren't being lifted, weren't having excavations, and had a great deal of concern. On top of it, we were hanging, this plaster was hanging from clay tile structural arches which also subject to degradation, particularly over the time by lack of maintenance, and it's a very fragile material. It has to be continuous to maintain its structural integrity. And here we were seeing holes, lack of pointing, people storing bicycles on top of it, all sorts of wonderful things. So the very heart of having to think about how we were going to lift this Fabergé egg through this extraordinarily complex thing, and that I and the team I was working with of structural engineers, theater consultants, acoustics, etc., were not designing anything. We were simply reviewing things and guiding things. And so we had a delicate position in terms of how we communicated that, how we protected the theater, how we represented the owner, and how we communicated with everyone who you're seeing present here in terms of design and development. And it honestly was a challenge, but that I think there was, in my mind, a cadre, a group of people who were problem solvers on this project. Many of them were here tonight. And that when things got difficult, everyone was there to figure out how to solve it and understand the different aspects of the project and the protection of the theater on one hand, this development project has to get done in the time frame on another hand. There are so many different players, construction managers, architects, you can see the number of people, and how did all that get communicated? And it was really, my fear that our little Fabergé egg could be Humpty Dumpty, right? And if we didn't manage to do this effectively. And I think, it was working with the development team, the design team, the construction team for the protection, the restoration, and ultimately the reuse of this theater, right? And we had a client who had been invested in this theater for 50 years, and at the end of the day, they were still going to be operating it. So we needed to know that it worked, right? And that meant the back of house, front of house, as well as the Fabergé egg. And we were involved from concept design and legal documents through construction. And I have to say that getting expectations in alignment, and you'll hear that from everyone here, I think was critical to the project's success. And I think one of the key words that come to mind for me was the group that we worked with had respect. Respect for the history of the palace, respect for one another, and respect for collaborative process. Deborah will now take you through more of the details of how we do that.
So give you some insight on what we're dealing with. The photo to the left here is actually very telling for us because that's the moment in which actually Judith suggested that WJE should get involved, given the concerns with the terracotta flat arch, which was above the ceiling, and which supported the whole fibrous plaster that we see here. So we got engaged around 2017, and a series of surveys parallel to the production of construction documents, I must add, was taking place. And in terms of survey, it's important to notice that you see the proscenium arch there, the two pendentives on either side. The proscenium, the pendentives, are very hard to reach areas, so we engaged an industrial rope access. We had to clean the plaster because there were layers and layers of dust. You could not even see if it was cracked, if it was daubs were cracked or damaged. So there was a lot of this scrap work to be done as well. We put the matting. So from that point on, we were doing architectural and also material survey for that. And eventually the scope of WJE creeped and increased to include the entire plaster, all the plaster services. There was a lot in terms of design that we needed to do here. This is a full upgrade of the infrastructure. So we have the theatrical booms, railings, they're all replaced. We are replacing MEP systems. We're putting new hot water radiators instead of the steam, which was causing leaks and damaging the plaster. So this is really about the work that we do as preservation architects is to make all these interventions seamless. The public should walk into a space like this and not really notice what was done. But it's really open heart surgery at the end of the day. So in terms of design aspects, I will call your attention to the fact that light fixtures were generally gone. All we had were exit signs from the, let's say, 20s, 30s, and we used that as an inspiration because the theater has always been one of the most significant theater in the history of New York. I would say everybody wanted to play the Palace, and because of that, we acknowledged different periods of decoration and interventions. So we had the deco colors in the 20s where it was green, and then we had another major renovation. You know, there's a movie theater at some point. You can see that follow spot booth addition there. So that was a big technical challenge. We removed that follow spot booth and rebuilt it on top behind those grills that you see there, and opened 5 new openings to improve the technical capacity of the theater, and designed the new light fixtures. So all that took place. And an interesting point was the color scheme, because we did the analysis, and you'll see a slide later on, which is this one. So on the right, you can clearly see all the layers of decoration that I'm talking about. And we made the decision to seek inspiration into the Landmarks Preservation Commission designation, which described the theater as old ivory and gold. And instead of using the red for the seating, we used the contrasting or counterbalancing shades of deep blue. How do you start a project of this magnitude? Documentation, documentation, documentation. So this is a combination of documentation and location, location, location. So you can see here high resolution photography throughout the theater. We did a lot of non-destructive evaluations. That's our starting point. And that was very helpful because it taught us, here you can see the steam pipes. We did that during the winter. So that helped us to then determine for CDs, for construction documents, where to make the openings to replace the piping. That's just an example of a useful one. This here, the laser scanning, another extremely helpful tool, gave us a BIM model that some consultants used and some did not. That creates a whole set of challenges for coordination later on. Lessons learned here. Probes, as typical, the difficult access that we mentioned, and then paint analysis, which the stratigraphy was done by Jablonski Building Conservation, which with PBDW, WJE were partners all along, working really close together with the advisory team. So mitigating risk was at the core of what we had to do, and that's the differentiation from your typical restoration project. Here we need to prepare for pre-lift and post-lift interventions. So we worked with Evergreen Architectural Arts to have plaster casting made for virtually every decorative element in the theater. And these molds can last for a few years, so it will be useful for the client later on. We also looked at some fragile elements, such as that register there to the right that covered, was all over the ceilings, covering ductwork, exhaust areas. So those only had those very thin threaded rods as support systems. So WJE also got involved into designing the structural support for a lot of the plaster where it was shown to be defective or fall short from current standards. And this is another example of some of the analysis that WJE performed. Remember the proscenium arch with the clamshells on either side, the shell-like? Those started to fall, and we saw evidence that that was a recurring issue. And then we monitored this element for a year. Eventually, through a crack through it, you could see that the section, the cross-section was really thin. You can see the fibers almost on the surface of the plaster. So we could not guarantee that that was going to continue recurring. Was an inherent issue with the design of the plaster, the execution of the plaster. So we ended up replacing those. And then some more analysis that were done as well. And here, just towards the end of my points on the design, maintenance is key for theaters. It's a big issue for them. Originally, the walls were covered in panels of gold, damask, silk wall coverings. We found a piece later on, but our original design was actually inspired by the historic photographs. This was created in collaboration with Evergreen. It's a print on canvas with a gradient to kind of give you the perception of the impression of shimmering, which the silk damask would give us. And I also call your attention to the difference in colors from that original photograph I showed, the early photograph I showed with pre-construction. we took the bold stance on changing the colors. French gray was mentioned in the designation report as an original color, also with a series of beiges and browns like the Victorian drab palette. Oh, and I just want to point out the new chandelier, which is also inspired by the proportions of the new, but more streamlined into the deco language that was created for all the lighting elements. Technically, this is the back of the plaster ceiling. You can see the straps coming from the terracotta flat arch, angle framing, and there were a series of issues with connections that were not properly tied or not bolted, length that was deteriorated. So all those issues were addressed, and where needed, where we have larger castings that were in a questionable situation, there was a lot of structural reinforcement to these elements that was done. This is a very interesting photograph for me. John's shaking his head like, how can she like this? Because this is a plaster dog. So under here we have wire, stainless steel wire ties, really connecting these elements, the framing to the old framing or to the aluminum. And then this was done pre-lift, and that's why it's interesting. Another aspect, we had to determine what are you going to do pre-lift or post-lift, because if you plaster it and then you have an issue with the lift or construction activities, we have to redo that work. So you want to protect Allison from structure tone who having to do it all again. And that's the final result there. Mock-ups. Not only paint mock-ups, but also, you see this sad swan of a foam core mock-up there above. So that is me sitting at night, 3 o'clock at night in the morning, and thinking, will the chandelier block the view from the follow spot booth? And even though the theatrical consultant had calculated in the BIM, I could only relax once I created that with the team. And after a whole day of going up and down, we decided to lift it 3 feet more. So the lesson learned is, do all the mock-ups you can, put all mock-ups you can on your specs, buy your mock-ups, do them in analog ways, and retest everything. And also the painting mock-ups. And this for me tells me about one of the favorite parts of the project, which is about collaboration and communication. These are the decorative painters, the amazing team that Evergreen brought to site for us. You can see them gilded there, that's aluminum leaf, which was then glazed to look like the old ivory and bronze. Coordinating the hands of all of these men is a very difficult task. And we have to be there on site, constantly checking and doing the quality control as much as we could. So that was a big challenge for everybody involved. But it was just such a pleasure to work with people from this team. I really had the most beautiful time learning from them. You know, arriving with the mentality that they're doing this day in, day out. So it's a very important component, I think, of the relationship on site that I try to establish. More details, this was the head painter. Sorry about that, but that's how the site sounded like it. True story. But you can see the beehive of activity that it was at any given time, and access with the scaffolds, and just a lot of traffic that Allison had to be on top of people all the time. Monitoring of the environment was a key item, and that's how materials came in and out, and that was a big challenge as well that we must say. Moving on, I will end with this slide. And then if you're asking me, how do you get to a project of this scale and complexity to be successful? I would say a mentality of collaboration, communication, finding your allies in your team, the people that can be on speed dial and text you 9 o'clock at night when you need to get that done, what you want me to do. That was ongoing. And also the determination to understand that you're going to go above and beyond for a project like this. And on that note, I'll pass it on to Dominic. It's going to give us the client perspective.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominic Canizo. I was a member of the development construction team. We had a pretty large team complementing a project of this size, but I primarily headed up a lot of the subsurface and the theater work for the developer. So I'm going to present some of the construction and engineering challenges that were integral to the project, one of which is the retained floor area. So while this project doesn't happen without the theater lift, retaining the zoning floor area is also a critical aspect of the project. So the Times Square area had been rezoned since the tower was built in the late 1980s, and there's a code that says if you maintain 25% of the zoning area, not gross area, you can rebuild back to the original zoning area. So by doing that, we were able to build to about 85,000 ZFA larger than if it had been just a new building. Here you can see, obviously that takes tremendous coordination between your architects, your engineers, the code consultants, and all other consultants on the project. You're retaining floors that theoretically shouldn't be there. You have to decide what's going to stay, what's going to go, how it's going to interfere with, the end concept, the end usability of the project, and then you have, the structural elements of how you do that. What's going to be temporarily supported and then removed, what's going to stay forever, where do we have to re-support permanently. There's reinforcing foundations so that you can get down into the basement, or add strength to existing foundations that have to remain. There was a tremendous amount of work that was involved in just deciding what could be removed and what couldn't, and how it's all going to end, how it's all going to work together in the end product. Top is just like a snapshot of one of the areas. That's the 12th floor. The gray is retained area, so we kept pretty much the entirety of the 12th floor. The lower photo is structure that was retained, even though the floor was not. So this is, decisions made to keep structure for reuse without actually getting any of the benefit of retaining floor on those floors. And then on the right there, this is actually what you're looking at is an area where the previous transfer truss that they wrote the ENR article about was removed. This is the cavity that the theater was lifted into. And you can see those members, the new looking ones that are underneath the floor above, those are there supporting those floors hanging from the truss, which is about 4 floors above this. So it's just a sort of a representative example of the amount of thought and coordination that goes into something like this. We have to have that close, we have to have the new transfer truss in, hanging the floors above, so you can then demo the old transfer truss and create space to lift the theater into. This is also done, those floors are hung because the end goal here was to keep sort of the theater structurally independent from the tower. So everything up to the 3rd floor is sort of working together, but from the 3rd floor up, there's nothing except that the theater is sitting on that structure. Other challenges associated with this work is the excavation work and the foundation work. So, we retained the majority of the ground floor. So when we had to bring equipment in to do excavation, it was incredibly challenging. We couldn't drop full-length caissons or piles into this space. We had to splice everything in 8-foot sections. That section to the right there, that's a 14 by 873, which is almost like a solid steel box. One of the largest sections you can get in the world. Had to be ordered from overseas months in advance, and these things had to be spliced every 8 or 10 feet, depending on where you were in the building. You see 2 welders there working on that splice. They had to do hundreds of passes continuously over multiple shifts to make sure the welds didn't cool. So this was days of welding, and we had dozens of these. So it's just a very challenging aspect of the project. Working in the cellar in general was difficult, working around the existing structure and removing things when the time came, but working around what had to stay. More on excavation. What you're looking at here is directly underneath the theater. So the theater foundation had masonry columns about 20 foot on center. Tony Mazzo, who was the brain behind the foundation and the theater lift, the foundation contractor, he couldn't move equipment in that type of space. So he had to think up an unorthodox shoring method for the theater orchestra slab, which is visible at the top of the left photo. Essentially, and you can't see it, but above the orchestra is a bridge, so to speak. So he hung the floor every other column, which enabled him to remove half the columns to make way to get equipment into there. So what you see there is you see temporary piles, which are supporting the existing masonry columns, and you see those angle braces going up. Those are bracing going to angled irons, which have hangers through them, which are being supported by the floor above. It's just part, one example of just the sort of outside the box thinking and the challenges that went into something like this. Excavating a new subcellar underneath an existing building, which really retained 16 floors of structure, was incredibly difficult. On the right, you see the start of one of the lift posts, which I'll get into more now. Oh, sorry, I'll do this first. This is another really uncommon and interesting aspect of this project was our new transfer truss. We did instead of doing a very complicated structural steel bridge truss, similar to what was there before, Severu, the structural engineers, came up with the idea to do a post-tension truss, which is not uncommon in the US and around the world, slightly uncommon in New York, not a lot of them done here. So these things there was 3 separate 4.5 by 120 foot long by 44 foot high concrete girders, which spanned from the 12th to the 16th floor of the building. Included in them were conduits through which high-strength cables were run, and as the building was raised, as floors were added to the tower, these were tensioned systematically throughout the process as different loads were added onto them. One of the challenges in doing this, and in mass concrete in general, is concrete temperature. So there were really large concerns around what the temperature of the concrete would be, make sure it didn't get too high, and how are we going to know what it is? And Severu, asked us to consider putting sensors in there, which was relatively new. The company that we engaged for it, we've never heard of, but it's since been bought up by Hilti. And we installed hundreds of sensors on the rebar cages, which gave us real-time information as to what the temperature of the concrete in there was, and allowed us to make some decisions. There were areas where it did get too hot. We had to do cores, we had to evaluate what happened to the concrete there, and it ended up, essentially we have to keep a waterproof paint on this truss indefinitely. So that's an operational concern that we need to make sure that as the building transfers hands, we put signage up there. Also, making sure that people know this isn't something that you can drill into or cut through, right? These are mechanical floors, so we had to coordinate all of the mechanical piping around existing openings above or below where the cables were. Just every project has its mechanical, MEP coordination, structural issues. This is like that, except a little bit larger and more complicated. All right, so I'll talk a little bit now about the theater lift. So here's a snapshot of the lift plan. And the lift itself utilized 34 lift posts, each with 450-ton jacks, and it lifted the theater, which was 14 million pounds. One of the most critical components of the theater lift was the ring beam. Deborah touched on this. So the ring beam, theaters in general have very little internal structure, which is done intentionally to not obstruct sight lines. So in this theater, there's 4 balcony columns and 2 proscenium columns. That's it. That was as part of the inside of the structure. So the majority of the structure is structural steel framing in a very robust masonry perimeter wall. So the way this was organized was we put a very high-strength, stiff concrete beam underneath the perimeter. This is called the ring beam. And what that does is it distributes the loads, the point loads from the lifting posts across a larger area of the masonry so that you're not getting differential movement in the walls as you raise it. In that lift plan there, you can see that there's you can't see it, but I'll tell you. There's 24 lift posts around the perimeter and 10 at the interior structure. Here's a snapshot of the lift post assembly, which it utilizes a hollow caisson, which was sunk 30 feet into the ground, or over 30 feet. And inside that caisson is a structural steel tube section and 12 threaded rods. So they work in unison to transfer the load from the jacks to the tube steel, which is actually what is pushing up on the structure of the theater. It's hard to sort of visualize this, but it's actually really quite simple. And what Tony came up with here is a way to lift the theater without having to rely on any interim load transfers. So even during periods of time where we were in the middle of the lift but paused because we had to install other structure, the theater itself is always being held on these lift posts, which reduce the need for obviously load transfers and potential for cracking or damaging the theater while doing those. The only load transfer we did was at the end of the job, end of the lift, when all the new structure was installed, transferring it onto its permanent structure. So here's a better shot of the working end of the lift post. No, there's a little video in here though. Sorry. How do I get this done? So what you see here is you see the tube steel, you see the threaded rods, and you see the jacks between two large plates. So the way this works is that each of those threaded rods has two nuts, one on the top plate and one on the bottom plate. And as the jack pushes the top plate up, the top nut engages. So that's what's taking the load. And the threaded rod is lifted because the nut is holding it in place. As you can see at the bottom, as the threaded rod goes up with the jack, the bottom nuts lift with it. So as this jack goes up to almost its maximum stroke out, which is we did about 5 inches or so, the bottom nut lifts up. And once we think that cycle is complete, what you do is you lower that nut, all of them on every single lift post, and that re-engages the load back down into the bottom plate, and you can then reset the jacks, lower the top plate, lower the top nuts, and do it again. It's very much like an inchworm. We inchworm the theater up 5 inches at a time, landing at 30 feet. For people that might be wondering, it took 15 days of actual lifting over 2 months to lift the theater up to its full 30 feet, just under 30 feet.
But all of them have moved at the same time.
Yes, and it's difficult to condense. I mean, we could talk about this project for hours, but I'll touch on, there's a series of checks and balances that were in place from the lifting perspective. We had internal monitoring, optical monitoring, shooting the ring beam. The contractor had their own manual survey shooting the ring beam. And we also had his manifold that was controlling these jacks. Each one of them, you can see here, had an extensometer, which was a wire that recorded how far each post was going up. So that went back to a computerized manifold where he was able to set in a differential that said if any post goes more than a 1/4 inch off the others, the pressure stops to that post until the others catch up. So that allowed us to make sure that we were lifting square and not inducing any differential loads into the theater. He also, as you can see on the right there, and Tony was very smart about this, and he was involved early on, but always trying to improve his design, continuously making it better. So one of the last things that he decided to do was the guide rails. So in addition to having these internal checks and balances, there needed to be some type of system to guide it up to make sure that if this failed, it didn't fall over in some way. So the original concept was to have like rollers essentially on the side of the theater that would be supported off of existing structure that would hold it in place. And then, Tony, I guess, thought, well, we have these 4 massive super columns with huge shear walls on either side of the theater. I'm going to build a sled that's going to ride up those instead. So at 3 corners of the theater, we installed a sled on theater, which you see in the top of the right photo, that went up a track, which was installed onto the sides of the super columns. And that, nothing failed, but had it, that would have stopped it from tipping, any further than would have been allowable. And lastly, here's just a nice shot that sort of ties it all together. What you see there is the ring beam. You can see it's, it varies in depth depending on where in the theater you are. The back of the theater where all the seating is has more load than the front of the theater. It's mostly open. You see the lift post. This is about halfway through. And then above you can see the new structural steel framing, which is supporting the Palace Theater Orchestra. So eventually, this area was infilled with new permanent structure, and the theater was transferred to that structure, the permanent final flow transfer. One thing, we talk about lessons learned. One thing that wasn't considered well enough was the lift posts interfering with spandrel members at the outside of the building. So we really didn't, this is quite a big miss. We did not think about how we were going to take these lift posts out in order to install this perimeter steel. And it involved a lot of coordination between the temporary structural stability engineer, the lift engineer, the engineer of record, to determine what sequence could we actually remove these things one by one, which had to coordinate with steel, which is already fabricated and ready to go in order to be able to actually remove these to get the new steel in to deload the theater onto that new steel. Now I'm going to let Allison talk about some of the other challenges from a CM and constructive perspective.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison. I was one of the many, hi Mike. Mike is also one of the superintendents on the project. So there were many of us in different phases. Oh yes, thank you. So here's a little time-lapse video showing the lift of the theater. Yeah, there we go. And if you can see on the right, there's a finger pointing showing the theater has its raised. And I don't know if it happened already. Did snow pop up?
Yes.
Okay, snow popped up, which was a great example of one of the major challenges we had day in and day out was like the elements, right? We had, this project spanned over 5 years, so we had, snow, wind, rain. Sometimes the facade was open to let excavators in. We had to reconstruct the corner of the facade, which wasn't anticipated originally. And then on top of that, tradespeople needing to load in, schedules to hit. So keeping doors open, blocking them open was like truly the bane of my existence and Mike's existence, because we had temperature, humidity controls all throughout the theater we needed to maintain. And then on top of that, demolition of an entire tower above, which you use water for dust control and you want to use it crazy amount, right? It's important for the safety of the workers, which is also important, and it's that balance and that, that like meeting that halfway and maintaining safety, but also maintaining the theater in good condition, right? So that was one of the big day-to-day challenges. Another was, in Deborah's photo, you saw all the scaffolding. We had to touch every single piece of the walls, was how it's written in the contract. So we loaded in the scaffolding, normal, 47th Street entrance, we had openings throughout from old fire escape doors. Then, as we're loading out, 4.5 years later, the theater's lifted 30 feet up in the air. All of those openings had to be blocked in for the structural stability. So we had to anticipate that, come up with a plan to remove all the scaffolding, materials, steel, all that stuff, all that logistics, that like day to day that you don't always think about in design, super important for us. Oh, and then the final fun, nifty thing someone came up with is we had to maintain standpipe access throughout the lift of the theater, which was crucial and required by the So I think it was Ron Pinella, if anyone's worked with him, but it might have been someone else, I'm not 100%, came up with a knuckled standpipe connection system. So as the theater was lifting, we had in the cellar, enough standpipe, and then as it raised, the theater raised, it would lock into place and then go into the next. So that way we were able to maintain, an active standpipe, which was, hard because the FDMI was nervous about this project too, right? If something happened, how do they get in and save it? And how do they save people? Yeah. So, what's that?
The power cord.
Oh, that's so funny. Dominic mentioned that too. And the power cord, we had to maintain power throughout the theater lift as well. So, because we had it was the winter, so we had humidifiers and heaters. And we had anticipated, right, came up with enough slack, but can't anticipate everything. It got caught on a piece of steel. So we had to pause the lift over the weekend, do a whole electrical shutdown. You know, it was either gonna move it, we had to build scaffolding, relocate it, refeed it. Was just one of the many, you know, you have plan A, plan B, and then you end up C, D, E, and F, so. But it was great, and everyone worked really well together, and it was like the best project ever. Yeah, my first official project.
I mean, it was her first project. So just, you know, we're gonna also have a brief panel discussion, and then we'll have time for a Q&A from the audience. So I'd like to invite the panelists up to the front.
Can everybody hear the recording? I think you might need to see
Thanks. I feel that, you know, as part of the collaborative team here, as well as in the audience, because you can see the various stakeholders as well as the expertise that was required for this project. I just wanted to, you know, get some of the audience to be more familiar with some of the challenges, but also the opportunities, because, like Allison said, this, you know, after this project, you could almost do any project, anywhere. So I'm going to start with Deborah. So, you know, I think that one of the major questions when you start a project is what could make this a better place for people? So there's a shared responsibility here for this transformative project, but also, you know, this being part of this entertainment and hospitality experience. What has it been, you know, as you started 9 years ago? Is your role that you saw yourself 9 years ago different than what you see now?
That's a yes and no question. I think I've been working preservation for 20 years, and I tell myself that part of the purpose in that practice is to really preserve buildings for future generations. So for me, that's inherent, the inherent meaning of what I do. In this case, being a public theater, a theater where we had so many relevant artists playing for so long, everybody wants to play the Palace. This acquired a bigger sense of purpose. I also think in terms of the sustainability question and the role that existing buildings play, this project came to reiterate that with the focus on the theater that we had. But I think in the long run it's so interesting, because as you start developing documents and you are listening to your client and you're trying to understand what's meaningful to them, what pressures they are under, right? That's a big part of the project. We think that this is what I need to do, but sometimes they come in with a pressure from an investor that we need to understand. As we do that, it's easy to lose sight of why you're doing this, and in the end, it's for that day that there is the opening, and the theater and the building is inhabited with people, and people are enjoying it, and people are outside of Times Square, people are inside the theater. So ultimately, it brought back to me the understanding, you know, like months passed by, and then you look back and say, oh yeah, in the end, it's all about people. At one point, those things about what we're doing. So, thanks.
So for me, part of the more interesting aspects is this entertainment complex that now has a face and a stage on Times Square, being able to bridge interior and exterior and how that development comes to play. So for Judith, part of the success of the project is, you know, I think working closely with the design team as well as engineers, and including L&L and Nederlander. So can you share some of the integration process of the theater to the broader project? Because, you know, obviously there's the dual of the theater, but then you have this whole mixed-use development around it.
So I've been an architect and a preservationist for a long time. And I have to say that one of the advantages is exactly having established relationships with so many extraordinary people, so many, you know, engineers, architects, consultants, contractors, craftsmen, and there's a history of awareness of what it takes and also the possibilities of new projects. And you know, as you've been seeing, there's interrelationships between the various firms. So I was brought onto this project recommended by Platt Byard Bell White, because I knew Charles Platt and was a co-chair of the Municipal Art Society Preservation Committee with him for a very, very long time. And he brought me on, and then Deborah was part of that team, and then I requested the WJE be brought on, and now Deborah's part of the WJE team. And you just see that there's a series of working with people and building relationships and opportunities that is really quite extraordinary. And I have to say, when they said to me that they were going to lift this theater 30 feet in the air, I just immediately turned to the developer and said, "Do you know Tony Mazzo from Urban Foundations in Engineering?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, we've heard of him." And he's one of the people we're considering, because I had worked with him in 1998, moving the Empire Theater for the 42nd Street development down the block. You've heard a lot about Tony because he's such a critical component of this project. And not only is he a very creative engineer and contractor, but he can explain things to people in layman's terms about, and I think in the very beginning of this project, making people understand how this was going to work, how it was going to fit into the bigger picture, how it could be coordinated, and you've heard the difficulties of that. So I think for me, it's really the relationships between people and between the parts of the project are what I think in the end was quite astonishing, not only from the past, but like working with Allison. This was her first major job, and Dom, as you know, mid-career, you know, and it just was intergenerational and interdisciplinary, and that's what made it work. Thank you.
So this next question is to both Deborah and Dominic. So Deborah, you started with PPDW, and then Dominic on the developer side. I'm sure there were many significant challenges. But can you describe a bit about one of the most significant challenges and how you tried to solve it?
So, I mean, we've touched a bit on the design and construction challenges of this project, of which there were many, and we really barely scratched the surface in the time allotted. From my personal perspective as the developer, the most significant challenge for me was actually managing people and personalities. It's not common that you're developing a project where you don't own all of it, right? We did not own the theater. The theater owners did, and they had a huge say in what was happening in the development. And there was legal documents and terms that were supposed to, processes that were supposed to be followed, and you know, things that were written on paper maybe sounded good early on that weren't as easy to do once you were trying to implement them. So the biggest challenge for me was just developing trust and trying to align, you know, expectations and, you know, corralling people with different objectives and priorities to ultimately, you know, end with a finished product that everyone can be proud of. And it's not just from the ownership perspective with the theater owners, it's the contractors too. We had, you know, dozens of different subcontractors here, some of which we didn't even touch the theater, right? And they don't want to hear that they have to stop because their concrete work might have caused the vibration in the theater. And that was incredibly challenging throughout a lot of the heavy construction part. So from my perspective, that was really difficult. I think how we really got around it and how we were able to resolve it, and what I've tried to do throughout most of my career is you know, considering the human element, right? You cannot please everybody all the time. You can try, but you're never going to do it. But you can, you know, try to get them what they need and as much of what they want as you can. So I think by approaching that from that perspective, we were able to develop a team that trusted each other, that understood that, you know, we might not always agree, but in the end, we're in this together to try to get this thing done. And we were able to work together to to get it done?
Very hard to think about a single complex challenge. I would say for anybody working in historic preservation projects, you have a set space already waiting for you, and you design one detail, and that detail is not going to work anywhere else, likely. So the fact that you had a $2.5 billion project and a schedule that demanded quick delivery of high quality, technically sound documents was very intense. And on top of that, we are collaborating and coordinating with the Mancini team because they're surrounding us all around, on all sides, and coordinating with Parking's teams and making sure that you don't have gaps between all the transition of these different companies as we're moving 1,000 miles an hour is definitely a challenge. So at one point, you learn how to prioritize the tasks. You are on the speed dial with a very visible client who tells you, do this, you know, don't do that. Can I do this tomorrow? Yes, I prefer this. No, I have a new task for you. Don't do that, you know. Or working with the other consulting team, at the time WGE and Jablonski Building Conservation, we were literally on speed dial. For the lift, we had a text message chain. This happened, everybody like all hands on deck. So I think coordinating for tight spaces around or within scope of other people was a big challenge at this speed. But again, the communication and the trust and the collaboration really made it successful in the end.
So construction started pre-pandemic. So Tom, this one's for you. Can you describe a bit about how the project had to adjust pandemic? I know that you're working in Times Square, the most trafficked place in New York City, being able to manage that and some of the downtime.
Yeah, so I mean, everyone remembers the pandemic, although it's longer ago than it feels, I suppose, right? So the pandemic affected everyone, and there were times early on where it was scary. It was difficult for the project from a number of different levels. The project itself was not really shut down. We think we were closed for less than a week. It was deemed a critical project because it was hospitality. But trying to manage the construction throughout the pandemic proved very difficult. You had fewer people in. We were shifting, the CM was shifting their personnel to try to avoid contact. We worked from home for a series of months, but came back relatively early. I mean, you cannot build remotely. Now, while the pandemic, I think, did prove that a lot of things could be done remotely that maybe hadn't previously been done, construction is not something you can do from home. Right? Even if you're not doing the actual construction, the architect has to go to site, the owner has to go to the site. Every consultant has to see what's being built to ensure that it's being done correctly. It had its logistics challenges. How do you tell 200 people, again, of different objectives and priorities, that you have to wear a mask? And how do you tell someone who's really concerned that you can't really enforce this to the way that you wish you could? That was very difficult. One of the advantages of it was the lack of traffic. So working in a site in Times Square and not having vehicular or pedestrian traffic was a slight benefit to the project for sure, being able to get materials in and out of the site. And then there were long-term effects from a procurement standpoint and cost standpoint. Escalation went through the roof on materials, and it was harder to get electronics, things that had to be ordered before you would typically do it on the job, just to make sure that we had everything that we needed. So it took a lot of thought as to how you could handle those things, and especially again, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? Like we didn't know what was really going to come out of the pandemic. So it was certainly a challenge. Not just on our side. I think every site in the city had the same type of challenges, but it was something that had to be considered.
Thank you. So, Allison, I would be safe to say you're probably the youngest member of this panelist team here. So, as you're starting off earlier in your career path, can you describe how you were able to communicate from a contractor's point of view, and also if you had mentors that help you guide you through the process?
So when I started this project, I had just graduated college, and then I ended up being on it for 4.5 years. So I think that initial, I know, no, it's fine.
I'm just cheering you on.
Yeah. There's initial like fears, right? I have a little bit of imposter syndrome. I look very young, I am very young. I'm a woman in the field, like all those challenges. And then I'm not on a very simple project. I'm on a large scale project with lots of pressures from different people. Was definitely a struggle in the beginning, but I was very fortunate. I had a project manager named Ron Pinella, who he had renovated St. Patrick's Cathedral. He'd been in the industry for decades and was the best. He was like my advocate and my mentor. You know, he allowed me to take on challenges, and we would discuss things, and it wasn't ever just, you go do this or you go do this. It's, well, what would you do when you're having this challenge? So that was like, I think my initial allowed me to have confidence because I felt his support, and he would always say like, you can't mess something up that I can't unmess up. Like, go, make decisions, fail a little. So that was huge. And then as I kept going, I like, you know, you start to make decisions and they start to be good, and you start to like feel that confidence a little, and you know, that sounding board, and it's just problem solving, right? Like I went to school for civil engineering, and it didn't feel that much different in that way. And then as the project progressed, and Dominic and Deborah and Judith and the other team members would rely on me, that also like helped solidify. It wasn't just my team. Like I had great support, like Mike Grabinski and Ryan Marr, like on my team, which is what you would expect and what you hope. You don't always get it, but once I was starting to have those exterior supports and trust, I think that was, you know, really solidifying.
Now you can do anything.
Now I can do anything.
So I also wanted to I also wanted to acknowledge that, you know, with Maxine Duffy as the AOR, and then also John Campbell here in the audience, as well as Roberta Garcia, who was integral in working with all these team members, as well as working with the facade and the envelope, and being able to coordinate with the signage. So huge thank you to half the audience here, I think, probably has worked on the project.
If you work on the project, raise your hand.
Yeah, that's what he said. So we want to thank you. I know we had some other stuff, but I think we're running out of time. But I wanted to thank everyone here, especially today, and being able to focus on something positive and something astronomical of the development that we've all had at hand in bringing to life. So thank you again, and then Rosa.
You did cute things. Thank you to the panelists, that was amazing. I mean, I could spend another, like, all night listening to all this, and it was just a great presentation, and what an amazing project. And you guys should be so proud of what you accomplished with this. It's really incredible. So thank you for coming and sharing your experiences with us and your knowledge. I think we all learned a lot, and it'll be so interesting to see it in person. I haven't been inside since this happened, so that'll be cool. I just have a couple of really quick remarks. Just a couple.
We'll do 5 minutes of Q&A.
Oh, we're gonna do 4 hours.
Oh, okay, I thought.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh.
5 minutes.
Okay, my bad.
Q&A. Yeah.
All right, I will take questions then, and then I will close. All right, I can pass around the mic.
So just say your name, and then we'll see how many questions we can get through. Here you go. Rosa, you can keep.
Sure. My question, how financially viable is it now that you've finished the job? Because like, you know, the effort of like knocking down the whole hotel and everything else and all the zoning, building up the theater, etc. Is it still financially viable with the whole pandemic and the hospitality issue, etc.?
So no, this was unfortunately not the most successful job from a financial perspective. You know, the job itself, you know, it was complicated, it was expensive, retaining the floor area, lifting the theater, you know, just to gain, you know, a full level of street retail and, you know, other retail space in the building. You know, back in 2017, the underwriting probably supported that. The pandemic had an impact, but retail isn't worth what it used to be, even in the middle of Times Square. So I don't think if the developers could do it again, they would probably from a financial standpoint. That said, it's still a tremendous building. I think over time it will realize what it was intended to be. Particularly, you know, the hotel itself is doing great. But the entertainment space and the podium space is still, needs to be filled. But you can get glimpses of it, right? When just this past Friday, Snoop Dogg performed at Times Square, and Post Malone did too. Like, there's definitely, somebody's going to have a success with that building eventually. Unfortunately, it wasn't the original developers.
Any questions?
And then, real quick, did you have to deal with MTA?
We did. So we had, as part of the agreement for the construction, we actually renovated the station entrance at 47th and 7th. We also had to deal with them from a monitoring perspective in the tunnels throughout the excavation and foundation work.
Chad Riley with Evergreen. I'll ask a flip side question to the financial one. Are there things that you really couldn't visualize how well it was going to turn out, or things that seemed like a huge challenge that actually weren't that big a deal?
I think the theater lift is probably the best example. The unknowns around that. Nobody, Tony would say that pigeons won't even know it's moving. But from our perspective, the amount of work that went into the stabilization and protection of the theater to prevent damage throughout the lift, it went seamlessly. I mean, there was some small hiccups, but all things considered, that went incredibly smooth, considering what was being done.
Yeah, I feel like the alignment too, we were really stressed about, like doing pre-work in the theater before, and then also work in the tower, but like that wasn't lifted to it yet. At least pipe-wise, we were nervous about it lining up, and it all actually worked out pretty well.
And I also think the theater really looks beautiful, and it didn't before.
And you have wider seats now,
You have better sight lines, wider seats, and better back of house and front of house, and ladies' bathrooms.
more ladies' bathrooms and.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. And this is one thing that AI cannot do. And just out of curiosity, who came up with the idea of just let's lift up the theater? It's just saying, well, why don't we do a new theater? And I know this is a question of preservation, right? But in terms of investment, right? Would it cost less to do something new versus was it worth in the value you put in preserving the existing theater?
Fortunately, we couldn't demolish the theater because it was landmarked. So that was totally out of the question.
But it was only interior landmark, so that's why you move it. And the exterior landmark you probably couldn't have, so it was fortuitous in that sense.
It changed even the entrance. The entrance was originally on 7th, and now was changed to 47th. And the Landmarks Preservation Commission only allowed that because as long as you preserve the interior, and hence the monetary protection, everything was done, it could be necessary, it's new.
There were a lot of concepts that were looked at early on, not lifting the theater, just trying to see, what we could get retail-wise if we kept it in place. And the answer was not much. With the entrances and for both the hotel and the theater, you really wouldn't make the project worth it at all. So that's really what drove the
Except
lifting.
now the market has changed, as you
Right.
described, and the retail space is empty. So this whole thing got driven by a concept that for the moment, and I think as Dominic said, the future may yield something else, but for the moment, that was the driving force, and yet it's empty.
Zachary Pearson with FMS Lighting. I'm just curious, there were a lot of incredible discoveries like the damask silk walls and other surfaces, but were there other sort of eureka moments that validated your design choices? I know there was a lot of mock-ups with different kinds of gilding, different kinds of paint, how the light would apply to those, but as you were working your way then applying those through the space, were there sort of eureka moments, finding things behind walls or things that validated your choices along the way?
Well, we did a lot of historical research. Higgins Craigbarth was the historical consultant for us, and that's like the whole concept of the old ivory gold in the description led us to continue. I mean, that wall covering design with the collaboration with Evergreen was done before we found the remnant of the wall covering behind one of the So I think for us, in terms of what validated our choices, we were fortunate to find things that confirmed that design. I think the hardest part was actually making a bold stance to design something new within such an elaborate, exuberant, plaster casting, Beaux-Arts element, and how not to conflict in terms of architectural style. And by the way, FMS did a beautiful job with our lighting in terms of mock-ups. There were so many mock-ups for the lighting, and they were there every step of the way, so that's another aspect also to point out.
Yeah, don't forget what we found when we were working on color scheme, remember? We did the original mock-ups, and then what we found when we get to with an actual finishes, that the half of the orchestra was done differently, remember? How we had to get it all together and get it like in the theme and in the harmony, and not to go over the budget to redo what was already done.
Well, it was the different hands that we're talking about, the different painters. You know, we were going there, WJ, BBW, Jablonski, the advisory group, we were going there twice, sometimes 3 times a week. And that's time, within 48 hours, so much can happen when you're painting. And then you come in and like, what happened here? This is darker than that side. And then how do you step back and harmonize everything? So that's what Mike is pointing out, the big challenge.
I'll add, this is not related to design, but we also found some really cool relics in there. You know, like old programs, you know, one of which, like, I didn't really know who she was, but I was Googling some people, like, we have a paper program, you know, one-time use thing from the 20s that has Fanny Bryce on there, who is, you know, a famous vaudeville performer. We found an old fan that has, like, a portrait of a flapper girl on it, and in the back it has a description and sort of an advertisement for the Palace Theater. Really cool stuff.
Yeah, and it was a vaudeville theater. It was built as a vaudeville theater, the first in New York, right? And then even when it converted to a movie theater, they still had vaudeville acts coming in, so there was a lot of history.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
I'd like to say thank you for a tremendous presentation. It was so clear, so informative, and so many new things that you touched on in such a complex way. I don't know how you did it, but God bless you all. My question, 2 things that involve structure. The way you stitched those massive columns, and you mentioned that you had to keep welding so that they wouldn't cool down. Is there a specific reason other than you gotta wait 3 days for it to warm up again?
You know, I'm not certain, to tell you the truth. My understanding was it was winter, and if you didn't do it continuously, the welds could potentially crack, and that was the reason behind it.
And the other thing is about the concrete. Could you talk about the issues involving the temperature of the concrete, what you really have to pay attention, and why?
Sure. So when concrete cures, it develops heat. So if you know, and if you go into any flat plate building, like the floors feel warm after they get poured. When you're pouring hundreds of yards of concrete on top of one another, it can get too hot. And I don't know what the exact temperature is, but let's say it's 150 degrees, which is probably way higher than it actually is. If it gets that high, it can actually create like micro fissures in the concrete, which reduces its, you know, structural viability.
Very clear. Thank you.
So we were also taking the temperature of people working in the theater because it was during COVID.
All right, thank you, and thank you for all your questions. Okay, a couple of really quick reminders. Just to recap what Rosalind mentioned earlier, we have some events coming up with Women in Architecture Committee that we'd like to invite you to. Please spread the word. The 21st of November, instead of our monthly meeting, we're having a gathering reception for our newly elevated fellows. So that's on November 21st. You can register for that online. And then on December 8th, we have our speed mentoring, which is a really, really awesome event. So we have that. Those are the next 2 big things coming up. There's also an event coming up that someone wanted us to let everyone know about. It's going to be here at the Center for Architecture. It's called an Evening of Fashion, Philanthropy, and Connection. And it's being, it's part of Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy are the presenters of that. If you are affiliated with Women in Architecture, it's a complimentary event, and there's some flyers up here. I'll leave them here if you're interested. Please take one, and if you're interested in that, please attend. I just wanted to tell just a very, very short, quick story of something that happened to me this morning to kind of close us out. So I was in an Uber this morning going between meetings and, a very stressful already start to the day. And I decided to call my eldest daughter. I have two, one is in college. So I was in an Uber and calling her on the phone just to kind of check in and see how things were on campus, just kind of what the environment was there like and how she was doing. And of course she didn't pick up the phone, so I had to leave her a message. So I was in the Uber and I left her a message. I told her that, I loved her very much and I was here for her. I wasn't sure, how she was doing, if she was, emotional or, about the whole election. But I said, I'm here for you and, we're survivors and we'll absolutely, not just survive this, but also, grow from it. And it reminded me very much of something that Joseph Campbell wrote about in his book, The Art of Living, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't before. But it's all about how, the most traumatic moments and, out of the kind of wreckage of some of that is where you really find your true strengths and your true path. So, think about this as, turning the tables on this and making it into an opportunity, which it unquestionably can be for all of us who need to work together to make the world a better place. So anyway, I was saying all that to Margot on the phone, then I hung up, and then the Uber driver said to me, I know that wasn't for me, but thank you very much. So anyway, it was very touching. So I thought I would also share it with all of you, even though it was said to Margot, I mean it truly to all of you. So, we have to really stick together, and we have a lot of work to do, and I hope we can all think about the opportunities we have to do that, in the coming days, weeks, years, months. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for coming out today. It's a great session, great panel. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.